For years, Lord Henry obsessed over finding the legendary ghost wolf that had saved him from a near-fatal monster attack, his jagged chest scars serving as a constant reminder of that fateful day. Little did he know, his desperate hunt was entirely in vain. His mythical savior was hiding in plain sight, quietly scrubbing the stone floors of his own estate. The winds howling through the jagged peaks of the Grimwood Mountains sounded like the dying screams of men. Lord Henry Cavendish stood by the massive iron-wrought window of his ancestral keep, a goblet of mulled wine growing cold in his grip. He traced the glass, staring out into the blinding white snow. 5 years. It had been 5 years since the massacre at the Blood Moon Hunt. Henry was only 22 then, a brash young lord eager to rid his lands of the giant timber wolves slaughtering his livestock. But what they found in the deep woods were not ordinary wolves. They were beasts of nightmare lycanthropes, towering monsters of muscle and fur that walked on 2 legs and tore armored knights apart like wet parchment. His entire retinue had been slaughtered. Henry himself had been pinned beneath a massive black beast, its claws tearing through his chainmail, ripping across his chest. He had closed his eyes, waiting for death. But death never came. Instead, a blur of blinding white fur and silver eyes crashed into his attacker. It was a wolf, but unlike any he had ever seen, ethereal, massive, and shimmering like moonlight on fresh snow. The ghost wolf, as the local villagers called the myth. It fought with an ancient, terrifying grace, tearing the throat from the black beast and standing over Henry's bleeding body to fend off the rest of the pack. When the remaining monsters fled, the white wolf had looked down at him, its intelligent, sorrowful eyes burning into his soul before it vanished into the timber. Henry survived, but the scars remained, both on his flesh and in his mind. He had spent his family's fortune funding expeditions to find the ghost wolf, not to kill it, but to understand it, to thank it. Yet, the creature was a phantom. "My lord," Henry blinked, snapping back to the present. His head housekeeper, Mrs. Agatha Gable, stood in the doorway of his study, her hands folded over her apron. "What is it, Agatha?" Henry asked, his voice thick with exhaustion. "The new scullery maid has arrived, my lord, the one from the lower village of Oakhaven. I hesitated to hire her, considering her condition. But with the winter solstice banquet approaching, we are desperate for hands." Henry sighed, rubbing his temples. "What condition?" "She cannot speak, my lord. She is entirely mute, and she is a strange, frail thing, but she works hard. I put her to scrubbing the grand hall. If she can work, I care not for her silence. We could all do with a little less noise," Henry muttered, turning back to the window. "Ensure she is fed and given a warm bed. The winters here are unforgiving." Later that evening, Henry descended the spiraling stone stairs to the grand hall. The hearth fires roared, casting flickering orange light against the ancient tapestries. There, kneeling on the cold flagstones with a bucket of soapy water, was the new servant. Henry paused on the bottom step. She wore a simple homespun dress of drab gray, but there was nothing ordinary about her. Her hair, tied back with a coarse string, was a striking, unusual shade of pale silver, catching the firelight like spun glass. As Henry stepped forward, his boot scraped against the stone. The girl spun around with a speed that defied human reflexes. The wet brush slipped from her hand. For a moment, the breath was knocked from Henry's lungs. Her eyes were a piercing, luminescent silver gray. They were wide, wild, and ancient. Across the right side of her delicate neck, disappearing beneath the collar of her dress, was a horrific, jagged burn scar, the cruel brand of a silver iron. Henry recognized instantly, a common punishment in the fanatic Southern Inquisitions. "Forgive me," Henry said softly, raising a hand. "I did not mean to startle you." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Slowly, she lowered her head in a deep, deferential bow, her silver hair falling to veil her face. "You must be the new maid," Henry continued, stepping closer. He noticed her hands. They were small, yet her knuckles were bruised. and her fingernails were chipped, as if she had spent a lifetime digging through frozen earth. "What is your name?" She looked up, eyes darting to Mrs. Gable, who had just entered, carrying a stack of linens. "Her name is Isolde, my lord," Agatha answered for her. "She carries a slate to write, but she is shy." "Isolde," Henry repeated. The name tasted like frost and old magic on his tongue. Isolde met his gaze again, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, Henry felt a phantom ache in the scars across his chest. A strange sense of familiarity washed over him, heavy and suffocating. Isolde quickly broke eye contact, grabbing her brush and scrubbing the stone with frantic energy. Henry watched her for a moment longer, a bizarre tightness gripping his heart, before he turned and walked away into the shadows of the manor. As the weeks bled into the harsh, unforgiving heart of winter, the Cavendish estate settled into a tense rhythm. Isolde became a shadow in the manor. She was always there, yet never in the way. She kept the fires burning hot, the floors immaculate, and the hounds fed. The hounds were the first anomaly. Henry kept 4 massive wolfhounds, bred for hunting and notoriously vicious to strangers. Yet, the morning after Isolde arrived, Henry found the alpha hound, a hulking beast named Brutus, sleeping peacefully with his head resting on Isolde's lap while she peeled potatoes in the courtyard. When Henry approached, Brutus didn't even lift his head, merely thumping his tail. Isolde had looked up at Henry, offering a small, fragile smile that made his pulse stutter. Henry found himself seeking her out. He was a man isolated by his trauma, surrounded by sycophants and guards who only saw him as a broken lord. But Isolde saw him differently. When he sat in his study late at night, staring blankly at the maps of the Grimwood, she would quietly enter, placing a hot cup of spiced tea on his desk, and linger just long enough for him to feel the comforting warmth of her presence. One evening, a violent blizzard struck the keep. The wind battered the stone walls, sounding exactly like the roaring beasts from Henry's nightmares. He awoke in his chambers, drenched in cold sweat, his hand clawing at the raised scars on his chest. He was hyperventilating, the phantom scent of blood and wet fur filling his nose. Unable to breathe, he stumbled out of his room and down the dark corridors, seeking the kitchens for water. He pushed open the heavy oak door and froze. Isolde was there. She was standing by the large, frost-covered window, staring out into the raging blizzard. She wore only a thin linen nightshift, yet she didn't shiver. What caught Henry's breath was her posture. The frail, shy servant girl was gone. She stood tall, her spine perfectly straight, her head tilted slightly as if listening to a frequency he could not hear. There was a raw, primal power radiating from her silhouette. "Isolde?" he rasped. She flinched, the illusion breaking instantly. She hunched her shoulders, turning to him with wide, apologetic eyes. Seeing his pale face and trembling hands, she hurried forward, abandoning her stoic watch. She guided him to a heavy wooden chair, her hands cool and steady against his burning skin. She poured him a cup of water, offering it to him. As he took it, his fingers brushed hers. A jolt of electricity seemed to pass between them. Henry looked down at her arm. Her sleeve had slipped back, revealing a series of pale, thick scars running down her forearm. They looked exactly like claw marks. "How did you get these?" he whispered, gently tracing the raised skin. Isolde's breath hitched. She gently but firmly pulled her arm away, shaking her head. She tapped her own throat, then pointed to his chest. "We all have scars," her silver eyes seemed to say. Before Henry could press further, the heavy iron gates of the courtyard below clanged open, accompanied by the chaotic barking of hounds and the shouting of men. Henry rushed to the window. Torches illuminated the snow. Riding through the gates was Baron Alistair Montgomery, a neighboring lord whose lands bordered the treacherous southern woods. Alistair was a cruel, opportunistic man who had long coveted the Cavendish estate, claiming Henry was too mentally unstable to govern his lands. By morning, the manor was in an uproar. Baron Alistair had arrived with an entourage of 20 armed men and his own pack of fighting mastiffs. Alistair claimed he was there to celebrate the solstice, but Henry knew it was an inspection. Alistair was looking for weakness. "You look terrible, Henry," Alistair sneered over breakfast in the dining hall, cutting into a thick piece of venison. "The villagers say you still wake up screaming about phantom wolves. It's pathetic. The woods are safe. My men have cleared out the stragglers. There is a difference between stragglers and a coordinated pack, Alistair," Henry replied tightly. Just then, Isolde entered, carrying a heavy silver pitcher of wine. As she approached Alistair's side of the table, his two mastiffs, lounging by the fire, suddenly leapt to their feet. The dogs snarled viciously, their hackles raised, backing away from Isolde, as if she were a demon. "Control your mongrels," Henry snapped. "They aren't mongrels, they're purebred killers," Alistair said, narrowing his eyes at Isolde. "And they don't spook easily. What is wrong with your maid?" Alistair reached out, roughly grabbing Isolde by the wrist. The sudden violence caused her to gasp silently, dropping the heavy silver pitcher. It crashed onto the stone floor, splashing dark red wine across Alistair's leather boots. "You stupid, clumsy mute!" Alistair roared, raising his hand to strike her. "Touch her, and I will cut off your hand." Henry's voice rang through the hall, cold and sharp as a drawn blade. He was on his feet, his hand resting on the pommel of his broadsword. Alistair froze, looking at Henry's murderous expression. He slowly lowered his hand, letting go of Isolde with a scoff, defending a broken servant. "Cavendish? You truly have gone mad." Isolde knelt quickly, picking up the pitcher. But before she left, she cast one look at Alistair. It wasn't a look of fear. It was a look of pure, unadulterated predator, assessing prey. Alistair actually took a physical step back, though he couldn't explain why. Later that afternoon, Henry found Isolde in the stables, grooming his warhorse. He stepped into the hay-scented warmth, closing the door behind him. "You should not have provoked him," Henry said softly. Isolde looked at him, writing quickly on her small slate with a piece of chalk. She held it up. "He insulted you. He is a dangerous man." "And you are a brave woman," Henry replied, stepping closer. The air between them felt dense, crackling with an unspoken tension. He reached out, his thumb gently grazing her jawline. "Why do I feel like I have known you my entire life, Isolde? When I look into your eyes, I feel safe. I have not felt safe in 5 years." Isolde closed her eyes, leaning slightly into his touch. A single tear escaped her lashes, rolling down her cheek. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to tell him that 5 years ago she had smelled his blood on the wind. She wanted to tell him that she had torn her own kind apart to save him, a human, breaking the sacred laws of her pack. She wanted to tell him that the burn scar on her throat was from the silver-laced chain her former pack, Alpha, had used to strip her of her voice before banishing her to live as a human forever. But she couldn't. If he knew the monster that lurked beneath her skin, the very type of beast that gave him night terrors, he would hate her. So, she kept her silence, opening her eyes and offering him a tragic, longing smile. The tension in the manor reached a boiling point 3 days before the solstice. Baron Alistair, eager to humiliate Henry and prove his cowardice to the local lords who had gathered for the feast, proposed a wager. "A hunt," Alistair announced in front of the crowded hall. "In the Grimwood, we ride to the northern ridge and back. Whoever brings down the largest stag wins the rights to the silver mines in the valley. Unless, of course, the great Lord Cavendish is too afraid of the shadows to ride into his own woods." Henry's jaw clenched. The northern ridge was exactly where the massacre had occurred 5 years ago. It was a blatant challenge to his honor. If he refused, his vassals would lose faith in him, and Alistair could petition the king to strip Henry of his lands. "I accept," Henry declared, his voice echoing in the silent hall. Panic flashed in Isolde's silver eyes from across the room. She dropped the breadbasket she was holding and ran to him, grabbing his sleeve. She shook her head frantically, pointing to the window, to the dark woods beyond. She grabbed her slate, writing furiously, "Trap, do not go. Death lives there." I have to, Isolde, Henry said gently, taking the slate from her trembling hands. I cannot let him take my family's legacy. I will be heavily armed. Sir William and my best guards will ride with me. Isolde grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. Her eyes begged him. A deep, guttural whine caught in her ruined throat. It was a sound so profoundly animalistic that Sir William took a step back in shock. Stay here, Henry ordered, though his heart broke at her distress. I will return before nightfall. Henry rode out an hour later, wrapped in heavy furs, flanked by his guards and Alistair's men. The forest was eerily quiet, the snow absorbing the sound of the horses' hooves. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers blocking out the pale winter sun. Back at the manor, Isolde paced the courtyard. The air tasted wrong. She could smell it on the wind musk, dried blood, and the foul stench of rotting meat. It was the scent of rogue wolves. But beneath it all, she smelled something worse. Betrayal. The scent of the rogues clung to the cloaks of Alistair's men. Alistair hadn't just cleared the woods. He had made a pact with the monsters that lurked within them. Isolde didn't hesitate. She threw off her woolen servant's cloak, leaving it to fall into the snow. She sprinted toward the tree line. The moment the shadows of the forest swallowed her, a horrific sound echoed through the trees, the sound of bones cracking and shifting, of flesh tearing and reforming. The frail servant girl vanished, replaced by a massive, terrifyingly beautiful white wolf. The ghost wolf stretched its powerful limbs, its silver eyes, locking onto the trail of the hunting party. With a powerful leap, she became a blur of white against the snow, racing against time. Miles deep in the grimwood, the trap was sprung. Henry and his men had dismounted to track a massive stag when Alistair's guards suddenly turned their crossbows on Sir William. With a series of sharp thwacks, 3 of Henry's men fell dead into the snow. Henry drew his broadsword, backing against a massive oak tree. "Treason!" he roared, parrying a sword thrust from one of Alistair's knights. "Not treason, Henry," Alistair chuckled, sitting comfortably on his black stallion a few yards away. "Just natural selection. The woods are a dangerous place. Such a tragedy that Lord Cavendish was mauled by wild beasts." Alistair whistled a high, piercing note. From the dense brush, massive shapes emerged. They were unnatural, hunched over, covered in coarse black and brown fur, lycanthropes, 5 of them. Their yellow eyes locked onto Henry, drool dripping from their razor-sharp jaws. Henry's blood ran cold. The nightmares had returned to claim him. "Kill him!" Alistair commanded the beasts. The largest of the rogues lunged. Henry swung his heavy broadsword in a desperate arc, slicing deep into the beast's shoulder. But the monster merely roared, backhanding Henry with a massive clawed paw. The force threw Henry through the air. He crashed into a snowbank, his sword skittering away. His vision blurred, blood pouring from a gash on his forehead. The monsters closed in, their jaws snapping. Henry closed his eyes, bracing for the teeth to tear into his throat. Crack. A sound like thunder erupted through the clearing. A colossal mass of white fur slammed into the lead rogue with the force of a battering ram. The black wolf was sent flying into a pine tree, the trunk splintering from the impact. Henry opened his eyes, gasping for breath. Standing over him, her fur glowing like a beacon in the dim forest light, was the ghost wolf. Alistair's horse reared, throwing the Baron into the snow. "What is that?" Alistair screamed in terror. The white wolf let out a roar that shook the snow from the branches. It wasn't a normal howl. It was a promise of absolute violence. She lunged into the pack of rogues. She was outnumbered 5-1, but she fought with a savage, desperate fury. She clamped her jaws around the neck of a brown wolf, snapping its spine with a sickening crunch before spinning to deflect the claws of another. Henry watched in awe and horror. The white wolf was magnificent, dodging and tearing, spilling dark blood onto the pristine snow. But then, Henry saw it. As the white wolf reared up on her hind legs to crush the skull of an attacker, the wind blew the fur back around her neck. There, jagged and furious against her pale skin, was a horrific burn scar. Henry's heart stopped. Isolde. Distracted by her defense of Henry, the massive black alpha rogue flanked the ghost wolf. It sank its teeth deep into her hind leg. The white wolf let out a very human scream of pain, collapsing into the red-stained snow. "No!" Henry roared, finding his feet and scrambling for his fallen sword. The monsters were closing in for the kill, and the woman who loved him was bleeding out in the snow. The cold bit into Henry's lungs like shattered glass as he scrambled through the blood-soaked snow. His fingers closed around the frost-rimed, leather-wrapped hilt of his broadsword. For 5 years, the memory of his helplessness had paralyzed him in the dead of night. For 5 years, he had been a victim to the shadows. But as he looked up and saw the magnificent white wolf, his savior, his quiet, gentle Isolde screaming in agony beneath the crushing jaws of the black rogue, the fear vanished. It was replaced by a roaring, incandescent rage. "Get away from her!" Henry bellowed, his voice tearing through the freezing air. He charged, not with the elegant, measured footwork of a tournament night, but with the brutal, desperate momentum of a man fighting for his soul. The massive black alpha rogue, its jaws still locked tight around Isolde's hind leg, barely had time to turn its hulking head. Henry swung the heavy broadsword with every ounce of strength in his shoulders. The castle-forged steel connected with the black beast's thick neck, biting deep through coarse fur and muscle. The monster let out a wet, gurgling shriek, releasing Isolde to blindly swipe its massive claws at Henry. The blow caught Henry's pauldron, denting the heavy steel and sending a shockwave of pain down his arm. But he did not falter. He twisted the blade, stepping into the beast's guard, and drove his dagger upward into the creature's ribs. The alpha collapsed into the snow, its yellow eyes dimming as the dark blood pooled around it. Seeing their leader fall, the remaining 2 rogue wolves hesitated. It was all the time the ghost wolf needed. Despite her mangled leg, Isolde pushed herself up. Her silver eyes were ablaze with a terrifying, primal fury. She moved with an ethereal, violent grace, snapping the leg of one rogue before crushing its windpipe in her jaws. The final beast, realizing the battle was lost, tucked its tail and fled into the dark, labyrinthine depths of the Grimwood. Silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the ragged, heavy breathing of man and wolf. Henry dropped his sword, his knees hitting the snow. He looked at the white wolf. She was covered in dark gore, her own crimson blood stark and terrifying against her pristine snowy fur. She limped toward him, her head lowered, a soft, pathetic whine vibrating in her chest. She pressed her massive, blood-matted head against his breastplate, right over his heart, right over the scars she had given her own life to prevent from being fatal 5 years ago. "You came back," Henry whispered, his hands trembling as he buried them in the thick fur of her neck, avoiding the horrific burn scar that marked her flesh. "You came back for me, Isolde." "How touching," a voice sneered. Henry snapped his head up. Baron Alistair Montgomery was picking himself up from the snowbank. His grand hunting clothes were torn, his face pale with terror, but in his trembling hand he held a long, cruel poignard. The blade gleamed with an unnatural, sickly light. It was consecrated silver, a weapon favored by the fanatic zealots of the Inquisition, designed to cause agonizing, incurable wounds to lycanthropes. "I knew there was something foul about that mute wretch," Alistair spat, his eyes darting frantically between Henry and the wolf. "A skinwalker, a demon in my lands. The king will reward me handsomely for its head, Cavendish, and he will thank me for purging a traitorous lord who harbors such filth." Alistair lunged. He was fast, driven by the frantic adrenaline of a cornered rat. He aimed the silver blade directly at Henry's exposed throat. Henry, off balance and unarmed, raised his gauntlet to block, but he was too slow. A blur of white intercepted the strike. Isolde threw her massive body between them. The silver blade plunged deep into her shoulder. A sound that Henry would never forget, a hybrid of a woman's scream and a wolf's howl, tore from Isolde's throat. The silver burned her from the inside out. Sizzling, acrid smoke rose from the wound as the holy metal reacted violently with her cursed blood. She collapsed entirely, her massive form hitting the snow with a heavy thud. "No!" Henry roared. He grabbed a fallen crossbow from the snow, a weapon dropped by one of his murdered guards. Without aiming, he pulled the trigger. The heavy iron bolt caught Alistair square in the chest, punching through his leather armor. The Baron staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock. He looked down at the feathered shaft protruding from his sternum, his lips moving in a silent curse, before he crumpled backward into the snow. Dead. Henry threw the crossbow aside and threw himself over Isolde. The massive white wolf was convulsing, the silver dagger still lodged deep in her shoulder. As Henry reached out to pull it free, a horrific, visceral sound of breaking bones and shifting flesh filled the air. The magic holding her form together shattered under the agonizing purity of the silver. The thick white fur melted away into pale, freezing skin. The massive, powerful limbs shortened, snapping back into the frail, delicate proportions of a human woman. Within seconds, the fearsome ghost wolf was gone, lying in the red-stained snow, completely naked, shivering violently, and bleeding from a massive wound in her shoulder, was Isolde. She looked up at Henry, her silver eyes clouded with pain and fever. She tried to scramble backward, a look of profound shame and terror crossing her delicate face. She raised her hands to hide her face, waiting for the disgust, the hatred, the inevitable execution. She was a monster. He had seen the truth. Instead of drawing a blade, Henry unclasped his heavy, bear fur winter cloak. He wrapped it tightly around her trembling, frail shoulders, lifting her from the freezing snow and pulling her flush against his chest. "I have you," Henry murmured fiercely, pressing his cheek against the crown of her silver hair. "I have you, Isolde. You are safe." Isolde sobbed silently, her tears freezing on Henry's armor. She buried her face in his neck, her bruised, cold fingers clutching desperately at his tunic. She was dying. The silver was in her veins, turning her blood to ash. "Sir William!" Henry shouted into the trees. The captain of the guard emerged from the tree line, bleeding from a graze on his arm, leading 3 surviving men. They stopped, staring in shock at the dead rogues, the dead Baron, and their lord holding the naked, bleeding scullery maid in his cloak. "Do not ask questions," Henry commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a warlord. "Fetch the horses. We ride for the keep. If she dies, William, I will burn this forest to the ground." The heavy oak doors of the Cavendish estate slammed shut against the biting winter winds, yet the chill inside the grand hall had nothing to do with the weather. The space had been frantically transformed into a makeshift trauma ward. The massive hearth fires were stoked until the ancient stone walls began to sweat. But Isolde lay on Henry's massive bed, shivering violently. Mrs. Agatha Gable, her apron, already stained crimson, rushed back and forth with basins of boiling water and bundles of yarrow. Standing over the bed was Dr. Arthur Pendleton, a grim-faced physician who had served the Cavendish family through 2 generations of war. His sleeves were rolled past his elbows, his hands slick with Isolde's blood. The silver dagger fractured when it struck her collarbone. "My lord," Dr. Pendleton said, his voice deadly serious as he held up a pair of long iron forceps. "The metal is lodged deep against the joint. If I do not extract every microscopic splinter, her lycanthropic blood will continue to violently reject the holy metal until her heart simply gives out." "Then extract it," Henry ordered, pacing the perimeter of the room like a caged lion, his armor still covered in the gore of the Grimwood. "She is not a normal woman, Lord Henry," Pendleton warned gently. "Standard anesthetics, even the strongest poppy milk from the eastern trade routes, will not work on her kind. To dig into the bone, she will feel every agonizing cut. And because of her ruined throat, she cannot scream to release the shock. The trauma alone could kill her." Henry stopped pacing, He looked down at Isolde. Her skin was the color of dirty ash, her silver eyes half open and clouded with a terrifying delirium. Her chest heaved with shallow, rattling breaths. Without another word, Henry unbuckled his sword belt, letting his heavy broadsword crash to the floor. He stepped forward and climbed directly onto the mattress. He sat behind Isolde, gently pulling her trembling, freezing back flush against his broad chest. He wrapped his thick, muscular arms around her thrashing body, securing her. "Do it, Arthur," Henry commanded, his voice steady. He leaned down, bringing his lips inches from her ear. "Listen to my voice, Isolde. You saved me in the snow 5 years ago. You saved me today. Now, it is my turn. You are going to live." What followed was an hour of absolute, unadulterated torment. Isolde arched off the bed, her muscles going entirely rigid as the cold steel dug into her ruined shoulder. Because of the scarred vocal cords from the zealot's brand, she could make no sound. Instead, she let out silent, breathless gasps of pure agony, her jaw locked, tears streaming relentlessly down her face. Henry held her together when the pain threatened to tear her mind apart. When Dr. Pendleton finally dropped the last jagged shard of bloody silver into a tin basin with a sharp clink, Isolde went completely limp, slipping into a deep, exhausted coma. For 3 agonizing days, Henry did not leave her side. On the 4th morning, just as the pale winter sun broke over the horizon, the fever broke. Isolde opened her eyes. The clouded delirium had vanished. She turned her head and saw Henry asleep in the heavy wooden chair beside the bed. He looked hollowed out, pale, exhausted, his face covered in rough, dark stubble. Slowly, fighting the stiffness in her bandaged shoulder, she reached out. Her trembling fingers brushed gently through his messy, dark hair. Henry woke instantly. The relief that washed over his rugged features was so profound, it made Isolde's chest ache. He let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. "Never do that to me again," he whispered. Isolde offered a weak, tragic smile. She gestured toward the bedside table. Henry quickly handed her the small wooden slate and piece of chalk she always carried. Her hand shook badly, but she wrote with desperate purpose. "Why did you save me? I am the monster from your worst nightmares." Henry read the words, a sad, knowing smile touching his lips. He reached up and unlaced the thick collar of his tunic, pulling the linen wide to reveal the massive, jagged, raised scars tearing diagonally across his chest. "You gave me these," Henry said softly. "But you didn't give them to me out of malice. You gave them to me because you threw your own body in front of a killing blow meant for a stranger. You broke the ancient laws of your own pack to save a human you did not know. You lost your voice, your family, and your freedom because of me." He reached out, tracing the horrific, raised burn scar on her throat. "You are not a monster, Isolde. You are the bravest soul I have ever known. And I believe I have loved you since the exact moment you looked at me in that blood-stained snowbank 5 years ago." Isolde's breath hitched. A fresh wave of tears spilled over her lashes. She wrapped her good arm around his neck, pulling him down into a desperate, bruising kiss. It tasted of salt, lingering fear, and unwavering devotion. But their fragile, hard-won peace was violently shattered by the terrifying sound of heavy iron boots and the clanking of plate armor marching into the cobblestone courtyard below. Henry broke the kiss, his expression instantly hardening into cold stone. He walked to the window and looked down. The courtyard was swarming with 40 heavily armored mercenaries, wearing steel breastplates, emblazoned with a crimson cross. Leading them was Lord Chief Inquisitor Thomas Hastings, a notoriously brutal executioner who had burned the entire village of Oakhaven to the ground 3 years prior. Baron Montgomery had sent a raven to the cathedral before the hunt. "Cavendish," Hastings' magically amplified voice boomed. "Surrender the beast to the pyre, and the Inquisition will show your household mercy." Isolde scrambled to the edge of the bed in a panic. She looked at Henry, shaking her head frantically. "I will go," she mouthed silently. "I will not let them kill you." "No," Henry said. The word was cold, absolute, and terrifying in its finality. He took down his father's ancestral greatsword, a massive two-handed blade forged of folded dark Damascus steel. "This is my keep, and you are my lady," Henry stated. "If Thomas Hastings wants you, he will have to drown in a sea of his own men's blood to get to you." Henry strode out of the bedchamber, locking the heavy oak door. He descended to the main hall, where the heavy front doors had been violently thrown open. Inquisitor Hastings stood in the foyer, flanked by 6 elite, masked executioners, wielding drawn, consecrated, silver swords. "Where is it, Henry?" Hastings demanded. Henry stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his greatsword. Behind him, the shadows of the hall shifted. Sir William and 60 of Henry's heavily armed, battle-hardened guards filed silently into the hall, their heavy crossbows raised and locked. From the dark corridors, Henry's 4 massive wolfhounds stalked forward, baring their teeth. "You are trespassing in the sovereign, ancestral home of House Cavendish, Thomas," Henry said, his voice deadly calm. "There is no monster here. There is only a woman under my sworn, legal protection. If a single one of your zealots takes another step forward, I will personally mount your head on the iron spikes of my portcullis." Hastings scoffed, though his eyes darted nervously to the sheer number of highly trained guards. "You defend a confirmed lycanthrope? It is high treason. Let the crown come," Henry challenged, drawing the massive Damascus greatsword with a slow, deliberate motion. "Leave my lands, Hastings. This is your first and final warning." Hastings calculated the odds against the 60 loaded crossbows aimed squarely at his chest. A battle here would mean his immediate death. Slowly, his jaw clenching in fury, Hastings lowered his silver blade. "You are damning your eternal soul, Cavendish," he spat. "My soul was damned 5 years ago," Henry replied coldly. "She is the one who saved it." Hastings sneered, turning sharply on his heel. "We are leaving." The zealots slowly backed out into the snow, the heavy iron doors groaning as Sir William and 2 guards shoved them violently shut. Henry sheathed his greatsword and sprinted back up the stairs, unlocking the bedchamber door. Isolde was sitting on the floor by the window, clutching her knees, tears streaming silently down her face. She had heard everything. Henry dropped to his knees in front of her, wiping the tears from her pale cheeks. "They are gone," Henry whispered, pulling her into his chest. "They will never touch you again. I swear it on my life." Isolde looked up into his eyes, seeing the absolute, unyielding truth. For the first time in her long, cursed life, the legendary ghost wolf did not feel like a hunted beast. She felt entirely human. She felt safe. She buried her face in the crook of his neck. Henry held her, rocking her gently as the violent winter storm finally broke outside, casting a warm, golden light over the broken lord and his silent wolf, 2 scarred souls who had finally found their permanent peace in the snow. And so, the broken lord and his legendary ghost wolf faced the world together, their scars a testament to a love stronger than silver or steel. If this epic tale of loyalty, betrayal, and romance captured your heart, make sure to smash that like button and share this story with your fellow fantasy lovers. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, dramatic, and magical romances. The Grimwood holds many more secrets, so stick around and see you in the next epic adventure.